This is Changeling the podcast.
Welcome to Changeling the podcast. Come for the glamour, stay for the vibes. I'm your host Josh, and with this is your other host Puka. Say hi, Puka.
Good evening.
What are we talking about tonight, Puka?
We're getting dark and dank as we talk about Thallain and Dauntain and the possibilities of playing as them in a Changeling game.
Yeah.
You, the audience, demanded. We, the hosts, listened.
Yeah, that sort of answers the question, why would you want to bring this up? Because people are asking about it, so...
Well, I confess, this is a corner of the game that has never really interested me that much. Maybe, I just never got sufficiently bored with the core kiths, or maybe the stories I want to tell just don't necessarily need Thallain or Dauntain, but I don't know, people seem into it. We get character creation notes in C20, so clearly someone on the writing team felt that this was worthy of digging into.
And we're talking about Thallain and Dauntain. Some of the stuff may apply to other things in Changeling that are not really thought of as PC focused, but this is sort of what we're covering for this episode. And yeah, how to play denizens would be like a whole other question.
Well, so I want to ask you, because I know you have you actually played Thallain, or have you just run games with Thallain PCs?
Besides NPC Thallain, obviously, I've never played a Thallain PC, but I haven't played a lot of... I feel like I've only ever played 3 Changeling PCs, so...
Fair.
Though one of them was a red cap that was pretty red cappy.
Well, see, that's the thing. Like, the sort of operative question for me going into this, or going into any dive about a group of Fae in the game, is what are the kinds of stories that one can tell, or that you like to tell? Because I know with Inanimate in particular, I remember going off on this like an extended rant, but the goals and worldviews of these groups of Fae can sometimes be so divergent from what the themes of the game are, that I think it bears putting front and center. So, I mean, yeah, we can talk about mechanics and everything, but fundamentally it comes down to the story for me.
And I do think, like, we're grouping Thallain and Dauntain, but I feel like in a lot of ways those are quite different.
They are. Yeah. I think they are unified in that C20 in particular presents them as, like, fundamentally broken people. But we'll get to that.
We might have different ideas on Thallain.
Yeah. Well, so what are Thallain, Josh?
Thallain are to the Fomorians what the Kithain are to the Tuatha De Danann.
There you go.
A lot of them are kind of alternate dark, twisted versions of Kithain or other Gallain kiths, but some of them are, at least in the C20 core book, are pretty... there's no real obvious Kithain equivalent or any other kith equivalent. So, yeah. And that's them. There's True Fae Thallain, there's Changeling Thallain. Yeah, mechanically there's some differences, but they're in some ways, a lot of ways, pretty close to being Kithain in terms of their rules, but not exactly.
I went through the Shadow Court again, the original first edition book, just to kind of skim through some details. And they're actually listed as forerunners of an invasion force from Arcadia.
What?
And that may be because the Fomorians hadn't really been created yet, but they are presented as like, yeah, there's Dark Fae in Arcadia, and that's who the Thallain serve.
Yeah, and then later, like Dreams of Night Years presents them as attacking. The take that we get is you have the denizens, which were... Okay, denizens are a whole other thing. There's a whole bunch of them that they're like, oh, denizens in general are servants that were fighting on the side of Fomorians, except for all these kiths of denizens that weren't.
Right.
But...
they are banned from the Silver Path, except for half of them.
Yeah, and then they present at least in Denizens of the Dreaming, present the denizens as the generals and the Thallain as the shock troops or whatever, which I don't think really necessarily fits. I feel like the hierarchy might have been more loose than that, but...
You say that, and yet another thing I noticed in the Shadow Court was that the first groups, the first 5 kiths of the Thallain that are introduced, are referred to as the Lesser Thallain. And now I'm thinking...
Yeah, maybe that's... Yeah, I think it's more the after-the-fact presentation. You're like, well, I mean, an ogre would be, sure, a shock troop, but, like...
A boggart?
Boggart could be middle management. Like, it's...
Yeah. Well, nevertheless, the Shadow Court book also established that they had been on Earth. It says that they helped drive the Shi out during the Shattering, which is quite different from what we get in C20, where it says they started to reemerge beginning with the Black Death.
Yeah, that was before they really got into the War of the Trees. That's before they had the aforementioned Fomorian.
Yeah, I think Fomorian appears for the first time in the Shadow Court in reference to the Fomorian blood of House Belor, but don't quote me on that.
Yeah.
Second edition hardly even mentions them in the core book. I don't even know if it does mention them.
Yeah.
They do talk about the Fomori from Werewolf, and it does sound like they're talking about the Thallain, so maybe there was supposed to be some.
And there's a bunch of books going, are these the same things? But
yeah. There's also, how there's like the orc question in Lord of the Rings about were they, and the films kind of complicated this further, were they their own sui generis thing, or were they corrupted elves? And I feel like we see echoes of that debate in the sort of different ways Thallain are presented.
That's the kind of thing I'm fine with being obscured by the mists, though, in your setting descriptions. Like, you don't really need to have the answer to that, so.
Yeah.
In my opinion. But, yeah.
Other things with C20, obviously we get a whole bunch of new types, and the Cup of Dreams novel, Immortalized Book 4, really underscores their sort of sudden prevalence in the setting. Because C20 is like, oh yeah, they all flooded back in with the Evanescence.
Yeah.
So...
yeah, there's one weird thing I just want to bring up. It's this obscure thing that I came across in Dreams of Nightmares. It talks about Thallain childlings who increasingly are born to either deformed or small or sickly, suffer these ravages in particular. And it's talking about in the deep dreaming. And I'm like, what? Anyway, that's just there's little baby true fate Thallain they're talking about.
That happens.
Yeah.
Mechanically, they now have Nightmare Legacies, which is always dominant. They can, in theory, have a Celia Legacy as their secondary. But something I hadn't noticed before, because I never build Thallain PCs, their Nightmare Legacy, they have their Urge, I think it's called, and it can regain them 5 willpower in a particularly meaningful moment, which is a little bit bonkers.
Yeah, they also have different seemings. Well, sort of like different named seemings that have different triggers and immunities.
Yeah, we'll get to those too.
Yeah. And they don't have reveries.
Well, yeah, so there's a lot of detail left out, which is frustrating. And I empathize with people who want to play these and feel like they don't have enough tools to do that.
Yeah.
I mean, I kind of feel like they are antagonists and you kind of have to live with it. But
I feel like if you're talking about Thallain as a whole, or maybe some of the more playable kiths, I think C20, as they present them, it is more playable to play a Thallain than to play in an anime.
That I can agree with.
In terms of what's filled in and mechanically, and how you could think of interacting with groups. I did run the game for my kids, and one was playing a Baelor Shi, and the other was playing a Beastie, both in the Shadow Court. And I think playing a Beastie versus a Shadow Court Puka would have fit just fine either way. So,
yeah,
for that character.
We need to talk about the Shadow Court too. And speaking of what they represent from edition to edition, because the Thallain are repeatedly said to be deeply ingrained within it. In first edition, I mean, the Shadow Court was basically just a subgroup within the Unseelie. It was the ritualists who wanted to return the Unseelie to their rightful place. Second edition started bringing in more of the Fomorian ties, started suggesting more overtly that they were aiming for endless winter. And now in C20, we already covered this in our episode on changes in that core book, but briefly, the idea is that it's now a, speak truth to power group.
Well, it kind of was that too. It wasn't just a ritualist group. That was one of the factions in the Shadow Court book. The Shadow Court is a big tent, and the tent's gotten bigger or more poles have been added. I don't know what the metaphor goes, but I don't think like anything's really been cut out of the Shadow Court over time. I think more things have been added.
Perhaps. And certainly the focus has shifted in a lot of ways.
But that's even within C20 as an addition. Yeah. Even though we only had 2 books mentioning them, they're giving different presentations of them.
But like I said before, the implication that I come away with is that non-Shadow Court commoners aren't speaking truth to power, which I find strange.
No.
I don't know.
Oh, that was not my impression. That was more like...
I, for one, am deeply uncomfortable with saying that there's commonality between Black Lives Matter and Thallain, who, eat people and whatnot.
Yeah.
So, if that connection is going to be made, I think it needs to be abundantly clear that the corruption is going in one direction and that the Thallain are the monsters for how they're using those tactics. That's my opinion.
Well, I mean, there are bad changelings.
No, for
right?
sure. Well,
Yeah.
so I was thinking about this a little bit. Like, I think if you wanted to play a Shadow Court game as here are people truly trying to affect social change for good reasons, and they are jaded about the state of the world and Concordia and whatever else, you're trying to do this good people on this slippery slope to doing terrible things in service of a cause arc. It made me think of like Falcon and Winter Soldier kind of thing.
I just saw that. I think what you're talking about, if you're talking about mortal society, to me that was the way the C20 core book presented it was more like this is some musings that they tend to do, not this is the focus of the Shadow Court at all for mortal society.
It says they're involved in the movements and borrow tactics from them and inform those tactics. So
yeah, so they're musing it. I don't think Black Lives Matter or other social justice things in mortal societies that important to the Shadow Court as presented. But
I don't know. It is not. I don't think that the lines are drawn clearly enough for my comfort, if that's the case.
Okay, that didn't bug me in the same way, but I also live in a different country than you, where I think this might be relevant at the moment.
Let me put it this way. I have heard plenty of people make the argument about those organizations in the real world that gives them, there's enough connections to conspiracy theory about corruption, etc., which we don't need to get into.
Yeah, don't do that in your games, please don't. No matter how strongly the book may or may not be presenting that, do not do that in your game, is I think something we both very strongly agree with.
Regardless, the Thallain's motives are never wholly pure. That's the point, I would say.
Pure. Let's get into
well, just that their intentions are never uniformly good, I think. I mean, I think that's kind of the idea.
Yeah, I think part of my thing might be a lot of people don't see the Thallain as playable, and some are. We'll get into the different kiths and things like that. To me, I think I see the Kithain as darker than a lot of the people making that argument.
Oh, sure. Yeah. No, I definitely agree with that. I would say on the spectrum from good to evil or whatever, there is overlap.
Yeah.
But just that there are Kithain who can be much, much nicer. I don't know.
Do we want to get more detail about the specific Thallain or rules for them or something like that?
So you came up with
we don't need to play. You can still read the book.
Yes.
Like that's... so I came up with a list. This is my own list. I categorized them at kiths that are easiest to play as PCs, kiths that are too solitary to PCs, kiths that are problematic as PCs but maybe could work. There's kiths that are very difficult to probably impossible as PCs, and there's kiths that I have trouble with as NPC antagonists even.
Sounds good.
For me, the easiest ones are beasties, which are like the twisted monstrous puka, boggarts, which are like the twisted boggins, although I will say I don't even know if the writers were intending this, and they didn't really seem to, but be really careful about anti-Semitic stereotypes with these, with boggarts in particular.
Yeah.
Boggies, which are kind of like twisted Slua, although they're pretty different in a lot of ways from Slua. They're like, they belch forth darkness, and they can like turn off technology, but they keep being restrained and stuff like that. Goblins, which are twisted knockers, even though not that twisted. These are probably the most... A lot of people, not just me, a lot of people said the ones that they'd be most comfortable with Thallain in their games are goblins, because they're kind of like knockers who are really big on blowing stuff up and making destructive things. Marrow are hard as PCs, but to me they're only about as hard as regular merfolk.
Yeah,
integrating into a Kithain game. Night hags, which they show up and they give you basically sleep paralysis demons. And then ogres, which are like twisted trolls. They're not about honor, but they're strong and they're dumb and they can smell Seelie, right? And those are ones that I think could be, depending on the Changeling, the Dreaming game, there are just as many issues with lots of presented valid Kithain character concepts as those, to me.
It's interesting that the original 5 kiths are all on that tier of the list.
Yep. And then the ones that I don't think the problems with them being too evil necessarily or whatever, it's just I don't know how to put in a game, would be Kelpies, Lurks, and Mandragoras.
Love them. But yeah.
Yeah, they're really cool and they're neat to bring into a game, and they might even be pseudo non-antagonists, but they're all three of them are not going to be hanging out in a PC group of any kind. Even if you're playing all Thallain, I don't know how I'd introduce, like, they don't hang out with anybody. So I don't know how you'd put them in.
Yeah, I mean, Lurks, their whole point is solitude.
Yep. You could also add in, I know they're not Thallain, but I feel like the alternate redcap swamp, what are they, swamp hags?
Oh, river hags.
River hags, yeah, they're kind of
Yeah.
difficult to integrate too. They're kind of pseudo Thallain to me. And then problematic. Okay, so there's the Aethu, a different ethnicity stereotype, but it's like dialed up to 11 compared to Bogart's possibly anti-Semitic stuff. There's the Bodaks, which are, yeah, they're about like hanging under children's beds and terrorizing and stuff like that. Those and Spriggans, my issues with those, like, I know for me and for a lot of other people, like, they're all about like terrorizing children and killing them possibly and stuff like that. And that's a red line for a lot of people.
Mhm.
So I think that's where it becomes an issue. And then Weeping Whites, like as NPCs, I wouldn't have any issues with them, but they still feel kind of difficult as how to integrate them into a PC group.
Yeah.
But I could think of ways.
Well, and they're defined by repeating their, whatever it is, their tragic story or their murder or whatever.
Yeah. And then probably impossible as PCs, but maybe someone could come up with something, would be the Ghasts, which are the Thallain version of Red Caps they invented and entered into C20. They're really about skinning people alive and things like that. I'm like, that's difficult. There's the Huakai Po, which besides, I am not sure about the cultural sensitivity around them, is also, they're not really play with others unless you were all Huakai Po. I'm not sure how you would do it as a PC group. They're like very fanatically devoted to Fomorians and things like that. And then the Severtal, which are all about mind control and turning people into Severtals and all that stuff. And like that's just like all the issues you might have with She, they're way worse for that because they're kind of the twisted She versions.
Yeah.
And then the two that have difficult, I'm not sure if I never have, and I'm not sure I'd ever would introduce as NPC antagonists even, are the Nasties and the Skinwalkers.
The Nasties, the thing is, I think if you dropped a nasty NPC into a game, you have the choice as storyteller to say, this Nasty's particular vice is something that can, not cross anybody's lines. But
yeah, and that's a big talk. We'll get into this, actually, safety tools later, but I think that's important for a game. But yeah, they're just gross.
Yeah, that is true.
Like, I think it maybe could be done well by another storyteller and maybe even the game I'm playing in, but I don't think I could. I'm not sure I'd want to bring them in. And for me personally running it. And then, yeah, the Skinwalkers have the whole, like, cultural appropriation of a badly done.
Yeah.
You can listen to our Nunahai Roundtable episode for some, but they're, like, definitely tied into things like that. Plus, they just got the folklore really weird, apparently, and even if you put aside all those concerns, I'm really, they're difficult
not
to have,
ideal.
so yeah, I don't know, but you think about that list, but
no, I think that I would probably be even more severe. I would probably not allow most of them. Part of that also, though, so just kind of moving away from specific kiths, I do want to talk a little bit about the actual differences in terms of character creation, namely the seemings and the legacies. So the seemings that they have, and it spells out in the book, that is the only mechanical differences. They have, instead of Childling, Wilder, and Grump, they have the Perturbed, the Prowler, and the Miser. So the Perturbed, their defining trait is that they fear the unknown. They get a banality trigger from facing the unfamiliar or whatever it is, and an immunity to a banality trigger from destroying anything that they don't like, up to and including killing changelings.
No, that doesn't. Killing changelings isn't a immunity. It's only dross, chimerical items, or treasures for
okay. For prowlers, they're obsessed with satiating their urges, which is the Nightmare Legacy compulsion or whatever, and gorging on dark glamour, it says. They get a trigger if they avoid doing so. So, like, your character is constantly going to be on that must do what my Nightmare Legacy says to do. And then they don't get banality from ravaging a rhapsody or from hanging around high banality as long as they're fulfilling an urge. The issue I have with that is like, I mean, much like with the Code of Honor merit, where you get the bonus for fulfilling your Code of Honor, it's like you can justify anything as being part of fulfilling your urge, probably, particularly if your character's whole thing is about that. You know, it's just in terms of game balance, it's not great.
Although that's still not more broken than Grumps, which just don't get it at all.
Yeah, but they also have the no banality through ravaging, which
Yeah, it's true,
presumably they'll be doing all the time.
Yeah.
And then the misers are these jealous guardians. They get a banality trigger for losing their possessions, and they get immunity for killing anything that violates their property without permission. That's what I was thinking of. They can kill changelings.
Yeah.
So like, these are already going to be real tough to play nice with non-Thallain SPCs. And I should specify, a lot of my comments here are based around incorporating Thallain into a mixed group. An all Thallain game probably would run a lot more smoothly.
I don't really see the issue with them versus playing with the right kind of Kithain group.
Well, that's the thing, the right kind of Kithain group. What would that look like?
That's true for any kit. Like, I think if you have people just picking what the game presents as valid character concepts for Kithain, of core Kithain only, and you make those characters, there's a high chance these characters are terrible together, and it could be very bad as bringing in a Thallain.
I think that it would have a lower chance of that than dropping a Thallain.
Okay.
That's my sense.
Okay. I think it would be about the same because there's so many. It's like, oh, you're all about killing the she for like ruling us, and you're a she. Or you're like a really bossy she of high title. Like, there are very dark Kithain valid. So I think like a dark Kithain works just fine with that.
Well, hopefully a session 0 would address some of those things.
Yes.
Because you don't want to have someone who's all about killing the she and a she in the same group, but it's like
or opposing the she. Don't have to be quite so violent, but like, yeah.
Opposing, I think, would actually be quite interesting to have in the same group. But regardless,
I feel like it wouldn't work unless the she was also somewhat okay with opposing the she.
Wow.
But
so then the Nightmare Legacies kind of run the gamut. Some of them are like, one is just straight up cannibal. So I'm not really sure. Yeah, I don't know. The legacies seem a lot more intense than a lot of the standard ones.
But there are some pretty intense standard ones, though.
Cannibalism?
Yeah.
Torturing the weak, vulnerable, or unsuspecting?
What about Beast?
Yeah, maybe, but a beast can just, like, destroy a house, and that would be okay.
Yeah. I mean, again, cannibalism is a thing in the core Kiths that's presented as pretty standard.
Just because the Red Caps can eat people, it doesn't mean they enjoy it. They certainly don't regain 5 willpower from doing it.
That's true.
There's also things, though, like the Judas one, where it's you betray people. Now, you don't necessarily have to betray your motley at any given point, but like that's sort of the implication, right? So I think that if you are a storyteller who wants to allow these characters, the heavy lifting is going to be on you to think through all of the possible ways that they could butt heads. And to make sure your players are okay with it, which maybe leads us into talking about safety tools.
One issue I have, which is sort of on a different end of this, but with their legacies, having a permanent secondary legacy that you never have, what's the point of even writing that down?
I guess just it's there.
Yeah. Unless there was some sort of rule that I'm missing about secondary legacies. Like, if fulfilling your boon of, or whatever it's called, of your secondary legacy helps you ignore the taboo of your primary legacy or something, maybe. But
oh, okay, wait. No, actually, here it is. I just looked it up. A changeling can go against his primary legacy's ban without penalty if he can justify it using his secondary legacy.
Okay, so there we go, and that also makes them a little bit more playable.
A little bit, yeah, especially if they have a Seelie one.
There's some pretty dark Seelie and not so dark Unseelie, but yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, safety tools.
Okay, so there are a bunch of safety tools. You can find stuff on the internet. There are different opinions about different kinds. I think, though, one thing is, like, some basic principles are, you need to be upfront about what the game is before anyone agrees to play. You need to have enthusiastic consent to play the game and continuing throughout the game. Mm-hmm. And these are very important principles, I think, for any game, but things can go worse, I think, if you're going down this route with these kind of characters. Like, it's more likely to come up an issue. But I think for any role-playing game, you definitely need that for sure.
Yeah.
Others, like suggested things would be like an open door policy. People can just get up and leave. They can stop at any time, regardless of what's happening. You don't pressure them not to. There's lines and veils, which is where I think we discussed it in the previous episode, but where lines are you're saying no, you do not want this showing up at all in any way in this chronicle, like players do that. Or veils would be you're okay with having it kind of in the background, but you don't want it any forefronted.
Mm-hmm.
Those kind of things happening. X card, which is interesting. There's like an official set of X card rules, which I really don't like. But the basic idea behind X card, I think, is pretty good, which is just sort of a way to say, yeah, no, somebody can just say, no, that didn't happen. No, we need to stop. No, we need to whatever. It's kind of like the open door policy, but also like, more granular. Script change, which is one that someone else has come up with at some point, where you can it's like using remote control rules. So you're like, oh, let's pause, let's rewind, let's fast forward this. Yeah, and unlike the official X card, you're actually allowed to talk about it, which I think is actually pretty. That's part of the thing with X card is just always shutting down discussion. It's like the basics is not good. Check-in, where you have sort of rules around. Yeah, it's like you can say like, hey, is everything okay? Okay, current scene. If you're playing in person, you can do like a thumbs up, thumbs down. That shows up a lot in LARPing, but it's also good for tabletop, depending on how you do it and what medium you're playing in. And then another one would be like debrief. I think that's pretty important, where either after a big session or even after a really emotional scene, the storyteller would talk to everybody about what's going on, make sure everything's okay. You could do either one-on-one or a group, or depending on what you're doing. And I think that's often, you might not need it every session, but I think that's a very important tool too. And there's other tools too.
Yeah.
But
I would add two things for the purposes of this discussion. One is storytellers, you can never have enough safety tools. And players, there are no bonus points for squicking out your fellow players.
Yep.
That's kind of and especially with Thallain, I mean, technically there is kind of bonus points, because if you are role-playing your character and your character is based around squicking people out. So
yep.
Storytellers need to reinforce that. There are no bonus points for
that. Now there is, again, enthusiastic consent. If the whole table wants to be doing that kind of thing, you need safety tools around it, but that's fine.
By default, though, don't assume that it's okay.
I think the rule is, by default, don't assume, period, for any role-playing game, is, I think, the biggest thing. Yeah.
Shall we talk about the Dauntain?
Yeah. Now, this gets trickier, because the C20 both did and did not vastly change the Dauntain. Mechanically, I'm not sure what the differences are.
I think it's pretty vast.
Thematically, it's a vast difference.
Yeah.
But they kept the same terminology for the most part and things like that.
Yeah. Just to be clear to anyone who hasn't looked at the previous editions, in the first edition, I would say the Dauntain are absolutely the primary. Well, they are primary antagonists. Maybe not the primary, because the Unseelie also kind of function that way.
Yeah. In the book, The Autumn People, they are the primary.
Sure, yeah. But even in the core book, you have Anton Stark.
Yeah.
In the Immortal Eyes ongoing chronicle, that was the first edition metaplot, you had the band of Dauntain that were primary foes. And they're basically presented as Autumn People but Fae, although that's inconsistent. And Autumn People, the book, highlights that some choose directly or indirectly to become Dauntain, versus some just falling into it. And the different dooms kind of complicate those situations in different ways.
Yeah.
Second edition, the core book basically just copies and pastes the first edition, and they do really take a backseat in the setting as the Fomorian plot kind of starts to rise.
Yeah.
So then C20, I mean, it really reinvents them essentially into changelings born wrong, who are striving to heal the damage to their soul.
But it's unhealable, explicitly.
Right.
Will always be bad. I find it offensive.
I kind of do too.
If somebody was presenting this, if we're going into a changeling game and the storyteller's like, no, we are bringing in the Dauntain as they're presented in the C20 book, I'd be like, okay, have fun with your chronicle. I am not playing in it. This is wrong.
Yeah.
Flat out. That's just my rule.
Because the idea of you were just born wrong is an uncomfortable one, especially in a game that is so founded on themes that echo queer experience.
Yeah, it is. So, talk about mage, some of the worst aspects presented about the Nefandi, but doubled down. It's so offensive to me. most of the stuff I'm like, oh, if you want to play that, maybe it's not for me. But no, this is not good.
Do you think it's specifically this is just your nature piece, or the it can't be healed piece? That is
It's
more.
mostly this is just your nature piece,
Mhm.
or the punishment. The way it's presented is just this, like, the moral taint,
Mm.
like something that isn't your fault, but you're definitely morally responsible for. I know that sort of falls under things like Gothic horror, but Gothic horror is based in a morality framework that I don't agree with, which I'm fine with playing with as themes, but like, if you start telling me that this is the correct moral framework, I have problems, right?
Interestingly, though, so I agree with that, but the moral framework that's being narratively presented, because we're still getting the same thing in C20, which is like, oh, the Dauntain are bad and every changeling hates them,
Yeah.
and it's always terrible when they arrive, etc., etc. But there's not necessarily much to back that up, because apart from their brands, they are functionally the same as changelings. Like, mechanically, across the board, they are the same. The only difference is the brand. And sometimes that brand can be detrimental to the changeling society as a whole. Like, there's the one where they have to consume glamour or whatever. It's like, oh, that's a drag. But, that doesn't necessarily mean they're bad people. Like, I think if it were presented more as they're changelings who moralize about the Dauntain in this way, I would be more willing to accept it. Because I could see that. And that would also kind of give more cover for doing some kind of, we should get to talking about redemption arc soon, but like a Dauntain trying to prove that just because they have this burden for whatever reason through no fault of their own or whatever, that they, that doesn't mean they are destructive to all Fae society or whatever. I think that could be, I don't know, compelling at least. I don't know if I would actually want to play that game. It's tough though.
So I think we can't see how we do C20 Dauntain as PCs, because we can't see how we do C20 Dauntain as NPCs even. But do we want to talk a bit about the Autumn People Dauntain as PCs?
So yeah, well, I guess how can we make C20 Dauntain more than just a set of supernatural flaws and some packaging, because that's what they are.
Well, I think you just pull out Autumn People and do that and update any, like, their mechanical updates. A lot of the mechanical updates are pretty similar. I don't think there's any rules issues.
I think the main thing that I would say is the rules issue is the banality piece, because C20 Dauntain you can hit with cantrips all you want. Autumn People Dauntain are probably going to have banality 8.
Yeah, but you can still hit them with C20 to cantrips all you want, +1 difficulty. Also, they're not necessarily banality 8. Depends in Autumn People.
Not necessarily, but they can be more frequently.
Yeah. Banality is less of a threat by far in C20, though. So that's...
But I would want Dauntain to be a banality trigger in the same way that they used to be. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, I mean, if they're banality 8+, sure.
Yeah.
But I mean, they weren't always just being around them a banality trigger necessarily. Barring...
Well, no, but they had a lot of other powers in the mix.
Yeah, but they have those powers still.
No, they just have the ruin art, don't they? Isn't that the only...
Oh, I thought they kept the stigmas.
I think it's said that only the Autumn People get the stigmas, which I found weird. It's certainly under the Autumn People section, so... Because that's the thing, you can have a Dauntain with banality 1 in C20.
Oh, yeah, they don't really... Yeah, okay, so you need to bring in the rules, more of the rules from that.
Shout out, as an aside, to Harbingers of Winter for trying to expand on this a bit. It does, I think, hold to the same general idea of what Dauntain are at the metaphysical root. It does give pointers on what a group of them might look like, because they still have a need for community. It gives a couple new dooms. It positions them as, like, whatever it is, reality warpers who damage the dreaming.
They're not called dooms in C20, right?
Brands, whatever it is.
Yeah.
The one that I would be willing to accept as a thing that, like, you were born with this damage is the reincarnation of a Fae slain with cold iron. I would accept that for their next reincarnation, and that's it. Because I do think that's an interesting...
Yeah, but then presenting that as evil is kind of... What?
Well, not evil, but they are the Furies, and I like that. I think having them consumed with revenge against their killer works in that sense.
Yeah.
Because there's also the implication of some of these. There's one of the brands, I think it's Brand of the Quisling, is like, oh, they're Oathbreakers. And I'm thinking, does that mean this is what happens to all Oathbreakers in Changeling? They
Yeah.
end up as these Dauntain.
But also, like, that's some of the things too. You're like reading this, and you're like, if you read the brands, I'm like, I know I just said you can play Thallain, but like these seem even not as bad necessarily as any of the Thallain. Like, it's very
Yeah.
like some of these. I'm like, why is that? I get why it's a problem.
And sometimes it's not even that much of a problem.
Yeah.
So it also makes me think about, I think that C20 pulls away a lot of the focus on the mortal world that the older editions had, which we've talked about before, for better and for worse. And the Dauntain, in some ways, are kind of arch symbols of how the Changeling's path, of living both their fey life and their mortal life to the fullest. The Dauntain, as a twisted version of that, loses a lot of its edge in the way they're presented here, I think. And part of that is the disassociation of them from banality. Part of that is...
But then they describe all these things that would be banality triggers that they engage in all the time.
Well, exactly.
And they're ruin art, and it's like, that's banality. They talk about them being... It's like they said they're not about banality, and then they give all these examples of how they're about banality. So
no, it's very inconsistent, and that's also, I think, part of the trying to make dark glamour more of a thing, which I appreciate.
Yeah.
But it just doesn't hold together in a way that makes sense to me.
I don't think they should be on the same axis as Thallain, Kithain. Like, I think there should be, like, there's no reason, especially if you're going with explicitly what they say for the rules in C20, or especially with the Autumn People thing, you could have Dauntain Thallain.
Yeah.
Sure. But I mean, like the Thallain, like, oh, they're dark and evil. Okay. Being Dauntain it's a different axis of problem.
Yeah. So all that being said, if someone did want to have a Dauntain PC, how would one?
Yeah. So if you're going with the Autumn People book, okay, the Lost would be difficult just because they would have trouble being around changelings, like regular changelings that aren't lost.
You're talking about the Lost, the Autumn People Lost, not the brand of
the Lost Doom. Yes. The rest of them, I think, could work in games, but what I would say is the Nihilists and the Typhoids, that is the kind of thing more, I think that can work if a player's like, I want to do this, but those are things some storytellers might think to inflict on their player characters. And I think saying your character's now Dauntain requires the player's buy-in, I think, would be a good way to go. And I could see that being both actually the brands in C20, but the Autumn People, some of them could just become Dauntain without the player wanting them to be, by how they're presented, and I don't think you should do that. The character doesn't have to like it, but there's a distinction between player and character.
Well, like being Gould, for example, is one of the... I agree that Dauntain should be a state that one can enter and leave within a lifetime.
Yeah.
I wonder to some extent... All right, so winding back what I said about banality, because I will acknowledge, if you have a high banality character, that makes it difficult to, for example, have a Chronicle enter the Dreaming, because it's like, okay, can they even walk on the Silver Path? Can they even be enchanted? Whatever.
Can they remember anything?
Exactly, yeah.
What happened?
I think the way that I would make it work with C20, besides making it not an inherent state, I would probably have the entering of Dauntainhood be, if your banality starts to exceed your glamour, you have two options. You can do what the book says when your banality starts to exceed your glamour, where you start forgetting things, whatever, or you start down a Dauntain path where you remember everything as though you were a changeling, but as your banality increases, you get further and further into that.
Yep.
Almost, I mean, I guess like a counterpart to Bedlam to an extent.
Yep. You can also do the whole Black Magician's route.
Well, yeah, they were my
those
favorites.
Those are very well. Those you don't even need.
Those are easy.
Yeah, they want to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, like, if the brands almost function like supernatural flaws, then being able to perceive chimera and changelings and whatnot when your banality exceeds your glamour, that's like the counterbalancing merit, and that makes it more balanced. So
yeah, I find like entering the Dreaming, I don't know, that doesn't happen. Like,
well, no,
if you're playing Thallain, there's issues with entering the Dreaming in terms of the Silver Path. Okay, but especially in C20, there's lots of other paths. And I think they can still be brought in by the other player characters if they're not all Thallain. It's fine. And then Dauntain, yeah, entering if you're high banality, that's a problem.
Yeah.
There's a lot of mechanical issues too. But yeah.
I wonder if there was just in playtesting, like, people weren't able to grok high glamour and high banality at the same time. Because when you think about Kithain had that removed as well. You know?
Yeah. I think, well, I've heard people, not even playtesting, I've heard a lot of people, including some of the people who wrote C20, saying, oh, it makes no sense. I'm like, of course it does.
Yeah.
You can just, both traits are high, first of all. And then the
Yeah.
implications are also pretty straightforward to me, but
Mechanically, other things that I was thinking about, which I don't think are actually mentioned anywhere in here, but given all of the scuttlebutt about the friction between these groups and the Kithain, it's like, surely there must be some kind of social role penalty in the mix. There's not, but I feel like there probably should be. There are things like Housebowmane will attack them on sight and vice versa, but that's a...
yeah, this whole social role penalty too, like, I don't know, with red caps, that feels kind of weird to me. But like, the social role penalty in general, it's like, why would everybody have that issue? I can see if it was like many people have that issue, but
there is a note that Thallain require Fey 4 to affect with cantrips, so that's important to think about.
Yeah, well, to affect other, there's the rules, like, they don't require that to require themselves, but they would. They're Gallain.
Yeah, exactly.
They're not Kithain, so it's the same cross.
Dauntain, it's unclear. I guess it's just whatever their root thing is.
Yeah.
So that could have interesting consequences in combat or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Although it's less of a big thing in C20. So
yeah, but really it just kind of comes down to look at the birthrights for the Thallain, look at the ruin art for the Dauntain, and as needed, those are kind of the mechanical things to grapple with.
Mm-hmm.
That and Thallain are almost always going to choose to ravage, probably.
Yeah. I think there's one other concern I didn't bring up that can definitely be a thing, and it's not limited to Thallain and Dauntain, but I feel like it's going to be a thing, is the special snowflake player character.
Yeah.
So you do want to be careful with somebody just wanting to play this because it's different. That's not necessarily bad, but if they're wanting to do that to basically steal the spotlight from everyone else, this is one way to do it. There's lots of ways to do it. You could play a she with play somebody with title 5. Could be a problem. You could just play a very rare Kith. You could play a Puka that then they're arguing it can turn into a dodo or something, right? Like, there's a lot of...
I mean, I'd probably allow that, but...
yeah. But I think it's like a heuristic when somebody's going, oh, I want to play this weird thing. Figure out why. The fact that they want to play something weird is not necessarily bad, but if they want to basically control the spotlight of the game, control what the game's about, to the detriment of everyone else, it's a little bit of a red flag to me.
The thing about a Dodo Puka is you better make sure you don't get cornered in a science lab, because you are never changing back if that happens. Mm-hmm. You're going to be on a webcam 24/7.
But the player might love that, because now the player characters have to rescue them from the lab.
Do they, though?
But that's what I'm talking about, right? Like, people...
No, I've dealt with many a player in that situation.
Yeah, or they're trying to, like, they're playing a Thallain, they're doing it because they want to shock the other characters. Maybe not... I mean, we talked about shocking the players as a problem, but they want to, like... A lot of player characters in a lot of role-playing games have the whole... Well, you're all PCs, you still have to hang out together.
Right.
And, I mean, that I don't like, but that can definitely be abused by this kind of thing, too.
So that's a good segue into maybe talking about the narrative side of things, which I would like to hold forth on for a moment.
Yes.
Because, I mean, obviously, Thallain and Dauntain are going to have quite different personal goals, and how closely those cleave to the group's implied goals in the setting, it's up to the players in the ST.
Yeah.
But, like, the write-up of Thallain in particular I want to focus on here, it's going to be difficult to cast them as, like, fulsome supporters of a constructive cross-Kith dream project at the Freehold or whatever. Like, they're not going to be personally fulfilled unless they're playing into the urge of their nightmare legacy, which very rarely aligns with what anyone other than a dank Unseelie are doing. And C20, more than the other editions, I would say, leans into them as kind of these original servants of the Fomorians. There's repeated references to how poorly they get along with non-Thallain, but there's vanishingly little about what it's like for an ostensibly human child to go through their chrysalis and realize they're Thallain. What does that do to them? How much weight does the community of the Thallain have on determining their path?
That actually fits in. I did run a game with a different Thallain PC I forgot about, which was it was the first time I did the all-family sort of setup for a Chronicle, and someone played, this was second edition, played an ogre childling.
Mhm.
That worked just fine, I think.
I can see that.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry, continue.
The other thing is the recency of the evanescence demands the question, are there Thallain who aren't changelings, who have just possessed mortals like the Sidhe?
Yeah, I think we need rules for, that's a whole other separate thing, like Arcadian commoners would be I mean, they don't have to be literally, this would not be Arcadian at that point, but...
Yeah, and talk about an alien mindset, right? Like,
yeah.
You know, so all of those are going to be the main hurdles to overcome from a character's perspective, or a player's perspective trying to play into this character.
Yeah.
And it's not that Garden Variety Kithain can't be selfish in the pursuit of their own goals at the expense of the motleys, or the courts even. It's just that theirs are much less commonly centered around being like toxic or destructive. So
yeah, it does work best when that is aligned with the player character goal. Like if you're all playing shadow courtiers trying to overthrow the Seelie hegemony, that works better with Thallain PCs.
Yeah,
but
and it also works well with just Unseelie Kithain PCs. That's the
yes, but you can have a mix that way, and it would not be so bad.
Frankly, though, I think like Dauntain are just easier to integrate. I mean, the narrative says, oh, they're poisonous, etc., etc., but it's not like they have traits that force them to play up their scarred soul things.
Yeah.
I could see playing them as basically, this character has a curse on them they're trying to overcome. And it's very easy to make a metaphysical change to the setting to say that.
Yeah. And both versions of Dauntain, it's a thing that could happen to a player character. Like I said, talk to the players, but the player might be, sure, I want to go this route. Okay. And it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be, I mean, it depends on the exact details of being Dauntain, but if they're like revenge focused or something, maybe they're revenge focused against an antagonist to the whole group.
Yeah. Another important piece that I think a lot of players overlook is the interaction with mortals.
Yeah.
I don't think that Dauntain are necessarily that different from Kithain. Like, again, it depends on the brand. Speaking of the C20 Kithain, there is this overall tendency to destroy glamour, which is a net negative for mortals, just as it is for Fae. But in terms of like personal interactions, it's like, yeah, they could hang out with mortals. I think maybe the most interesting to me in that regard is the brand of the Forsaken, which they can't regain glamour from any dreamer who does not suffer nightmares. I'm like, that's really interesting. That's not necessarily overtly harmful to the mortal.
No. You could be a therapist.
Yeah, exactly.
Very good therapist.
Yeah. But they're broken people. So, and then, I mean, I think pointing back to your list from before, Thallain, it depends on the Kith.
Yeah.
Like, some are going to be absolutely incapable of interacting with mortals. So,
yeah. Well, or the interactions are not favorable for the mortals.
No, yeah, that is also true. And any storyteller, like, all right, storytellers, I urge you, think about the role you want mortals to play within your game. Are they just there to be glamour bags, or are players expected to build lasting relationships with them? I prefer the latter myself.
Yeah, I feel like changelings, and this is why like I bring back some of the older Bedlam rules, although incorporated into the new rules, but like having no mortal ties, I feel like should be going right down the path of Bedlam pretty quickly.
Agreed.
So,
yeah.
It's like you need to have mortals you interact with. They could be family, they could be friends, they could be coworkers, they could be neighbors, they could be people that you're helping, they could be people that you're arguing with, but like you need to have interactions, I think.
And the seemings and legacies of Thallain are rarely pointed in a direction that goes smoothly in that regard.
Although I can definitely think of people I've known personally that could have had those legacies.
Yeah. So then in terms of like the stories and situations that you can have with a motley of mixed Thallain and non-Thallain and what you have to do to make the setting capable of accommodating them, there's a few approaches that I can see. The maybe obvious one is the strange bedfellows kind of thing, where it's like, circumstances have forced us to work together. And I mean, allowing this already kind of feels like a setting change, but it's not explicitly forbidden. You could do an enemy of my enemy thing, or a we're all trapped in this building kind of thing.
Work together, because that's not even explicitly... There are ways in the setting that they aren't always opposed to each other.
Yeah.
Like the Shadow Court, right? Like it's the... Shadow Court lived for the Thallain a lot, but...
And that's the other primary option is you're running a Shadow Court game.
Yeah.
I do think, similar to storytellers think about the role of your mortals, I also say storytellers think about what the Shadow Court is in your game. Because, like you were pointing to, it is this big tent. It's going to be very difficult to have one game incorporate all of the possible things the Shadow Court can be. So,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, the other way is you're a group of probably commoners, disconnected. You're not like super into the norms of changeling society. And for whatever reason, it could be family, it could be found family or whatever, but like some of those kiths I was saying is not being so problematic with the right legacy, nightmare legacy and whatnot. They could be like in your group, right? You could have a beastie or an ogre or a goblin, especially those three would probably be the easiest for this, where they, it's like, okay, maybe it was a kid or maybe it was like somebody like you're seeing them as like your buddy, kind of. Like it's not, and you do have ties to each other. Like Thallain are capable of, at least some of them are capable of empathy and compassion and interpersonal and liking people and caring about others, and like it's possible. Otherwise, they wouldn't even work for all Thallain groups. So
Yeah. And they were raised human, presumably. So they
yeah,
have that basis.
like just think about your player characters. Like, okay, yeah, the Thallain were servants of the Fomorian. The Kithain were servants of the Tuatha De Danann. There's definitely valid Kithain player characters who would be like flipping the middle finger at the Tuatha De Danann, giving them orders, right? So
Absolutely.
Thallain are the same way. They're at least they're not all automatically loyal.
The one thing that I want to stress, though, is in the books it is presented as the Black Court within the Shadow Court is the Thallain running the show behind the scenes, and
Yep.
that's like an important piece to think about when setting up that game. It's like, do you still want that to actually be the case or no?
Oh, but that's even for NPCs. It doesn't.
Yeah.
Your PCs do not have, even if you're playing Thallain, they do not have to be the ones running behind the scenes. I think most Thallainers still have no idea what's going on with the
Right. No, I'm just saying from
Yeah.
the point of view of the storyteller, it's important to establish that before running that game. So then you've also done the family approach, which I think is an interesting way to do it.
Yeah.
Because when your kids were playing, they were playing relatives.
Oh, no, they were not family. Sorry, that was not one of them playing family. The players were family, not the characters.
Okay,
so they were the two characters were in that time. They played in multiple Chronicles of mine, and this one was they were both Shadow Court. So there was the Beastie and the Autumn Baelor She, right? And actually, the Autumn Baelor She was low ranked in the Shadow Court, and the Beastie was like high ranked with we used the backgrounds and stuff from the C20 Player's Guide. Yeah, they were like going on missions and stuff, and it was very mission based. Like, oh, here's your boss. When we did like weird meetups and stuff like that, and it's like, oh, let's go do things. But then they also would like do their own goals together and stuff like that. And I would say of the two, the She was much more vicious and nasty to people. The Beastie might eat you, but
so I mean, I was thinking about it from the perspective of your characters are family members, and one of them happens to be a Thallain. Is another way.
Yeah, I did that. I did do that another time.
Okay, all right.
And that group was one of the player characters. Yeah, it was his second edition. Played an ogre childling, and he was going to school and he was having lots of trouble in school, as you might imagine, for various reasons. But you have, he's the not so bright, somewhat violent kid who loved his family and was kind of not big about people outside his family. So that worked.
Yeah, so I think that's doable.
Yep.
The last thing is you can also just kind of downplay the significance of a lot of this. Like, make Dauntain brands less defining of identity, make the divisions between groups of Fae less stark, downplay the significance of legacies and seemings, all of which are major narrative changes to the setting in and of themselves.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like in D&D when you have players in the same party who are like lawful good and chaotic evil. And it's like, if you stop and think about it for even a second, how does that work?
I would have more of a problem with that than Thallain. Like, I don't think you have to change the setting or the mechanics so much as make sure the choices of like which legacies and which kith and which doom or brand or whatever, right? Like, make sure all those fit. C20 Dauntain, there is the whole other issue I have with them, right? But if you dealt with that, even if Changeling Society has a problem with this, Changeling Society has a problem with a lot of things. That doesn't mean every single Changeling feels that way.
Yeah.
You could have a grouping. It's like, oh yeah, the PCs do this. And there's a lot of Thallain that hide who they are, canonically, there's like a bunch of, especially like the unseelie kiths, there's knockers who hang out with goblins, and some of the knockers know, but they don't let anyone, they tell everyone else it's a knocker. Like, that kind of thing does happen. Yeah.
So I'm just saying this as an option.
Yeah.
You could say none of these differences are significant enough to prevent these characters from working together.
Yeah. And you can also, if you're not playing in Concordia, so little's defined about how things work that all the stuff they say, we really only know that's true for Concordia. We don't know as much about how like the Thallain are treated in other places and things like that.
So the last sort of related question here is thinking about individual growth for Thallain and Dauntain.
Yeah.
And I'd say that parallels between there's just being a PC. Like, your character will want to be the central figure in a capital S story. They'll want to retain their glamour. They'll want to have an impact on the world and the people in it. But I'd argue that a changeling's path, I know I focus on this excessively, but to reconcile the mortal and fey halves, to live both lives well, this time around the wheel. And fundamentally, that's going to be difficult for the Thallain, because living their lives well and being true to themselves often entails breaking any number of mortal and or fey laws. And for the Dauntain, however well they live their lives, they're damned on the next turn of the wheel, the way they're written. So thinking about what their arc looks like, in a way, Dauntain have a much more clear and digestible capital G goal. They want to heal the damage to their soul.
Yep.
When they were more involved with banality, they had a more diverse set of goals to draw on. Like, my favorite actually might be the apostates, who are like, no, come on, we all have to die by cold iron, guys.
Yeah. Dauntain are defined by arcs, really. They're about their place on the arc. You can start that arc, you can finish that arc between player characters. Thallain, I don't think, they're not really arc-based.
Right. The only clear unifying thing is that theoretically they're all on board with bringing back Fomorian rule, which is A, not necessarily true, and B, probably not a direction you want your game to go. So you do need a more concrete idea of who they are as characters and an arc that evolves with them as an individual, which brings us to the idea of the redemption arc and its inverse, the corruption arc.
Yeah.
So like I said, the Dauntain, it doesn't really lay out how you might overcome that damage or how a Thallain might be absolved of their lifetimes of misdeeds. But
I have issues with trying to redeem a Thallain.
I do too.
That feels like it goes against the themes of Changeling. That's getting into like conversion camp to me.
No, I agree. I think for both of them it's an issue, but I think that's my sense is if people are playing these characters, that's often what they're tempted to do. And I think that it just kind of requires framing in the right way.
Yeah, the Dauntain you can do, especially the autumn people. They talk about the corruption arc of going down. The corruption and redemption might be kind of the wrong terms, especially redemption. But but like the becoming Dauntain and becoming not Dauntain arcs, right? Like I guess some of the Dauntain are corrupted in the more morally neutral sense. But
certainly the ones that become Dauntain because they thirst for power are
that's and those I feel like are not at that point. Like go with the classic villain thing, and you can do that as a tragedy, and then you're overcome by their lust for power is what destroys them ultimately.
Yeah,
which I think is fine for PCs, but
well, it's fine with the right group. But the issue I have is like, okay, once you hit the bottom of the downward spiral, then what? I think it's hard to sustain a chronicle along that arc of corruption.
But you don't have to have chronicles. Can be limited run, and all player characters in the chronicle don't all have to last through it. There's nothing wrong with doing something like, this went through 12 sessions and we're clearly done. Nothing bad happened. We've completed it.
We are clearly all evil.
Yeah, it's like we have completed this chronicle. All done. Yay! Pat ourselves on the back. We did it.
Yeah, the redemption arc is certainly the harder needle to thread, though. Thinking about the term and like how to reframe it, it makes me think of, like the scorpion folktale where it's like the scorpion on the river and all that.
Yeah.
I think maybe just kind of focusing on actions rather than nature and trying to, like, if you have a character who recognizes that they have done foul deeds and wants to make up for it, that's not necessarily a commentary on their fundamental self. And I think that that's kind of how I would try to approach it. Certainly not easy to roleplay in either case, but I think that you could have actions living side by side with guilt or whatever, and that makes for a compelling character story.
Yep.
So yeah. Anyway, if you're able to thread all of those needles and deal with all the weirdness that comes out of that and think about the mechanics and think about the story structure, what kinds of PCs can you actually create? I had a few random ideas. One is the classic bogey nurse who feeds on fluids. I think because you can set that up to be fairly victimless, other Fae might still hate your guts, but it's like, it's appealing because you're not actively murdering people or trashing the dreaming.
Yeah.
And you aren't necessarily leaning into your nightmare legacy or your seeming to the point that you're like cross purposes. Just fill up your flask with plasma before you head on an adventure and you're good.
And the other thing with bogeys, there's a lot of character concepts from Vampire the Masquerade
Yes.
that would work with that kith. Like, how are you dealing with drinking blood? It doesn't have to be blood. There's other things you can drink.
Yep.
Is it, they all drink things? Is it always, human organ or bodily fluid? Okay, human organ.
Yeah, they can.
Harder
They can
to do
eat
that way.
hair. Be a hairstylist. Just eat all of the hair off the floor.
Yeah, who's also like a super spy. I mean, they're really cool. They're like good at breaking into places too. It's interesting,
but not at being confined.
Yeah.
The other classic is the Goblin Demo Expert, because the line between well-adjusted goblin and particularly manic knocker is a very thin one, and
yes,
an unseelie motley would benefit from their expertise. I just want to play. Do you remember from The Tick, the Midnight Bomber, what bombs at midnight?
Yes, I kept saying the bomb. Yeah, yes.
Perfect.
That's a little bit one note for a player character, but yes, I think that you could extend that.
Yeah. The other is, if I were to do a Dauntain, I think that Brand of the Warlock as an anti-hero PC, I could see setting something up like in a past life, they did something, they attempted to gain true immortality through magic or whatever, and it went wrong, and now their brand lasts for 7 lifetimes or something. Yep. I'm willing to accept fundamentally broken if there is a good story reason behind it and it has a finite time limit / end condition. Not just, that's the way it is, and the core book doesn't provide that.
Yeah,
so
yeah. I mean, my biggest thing, if you take out if it's like, oh, the dreamings marked them, but you take away the divine command idea that the dreaming's morally right, it's a lot easier to stomach, I think.
Yeah, the dreaming should contain everything.
Yeah. They're just like the Thallain are just as of the dreaming as the Kithain. So,
and with the Dauntain, with that warlock idea, I mean, you have all kinds of mage. Essentially, they just have the phylactery flaw from mage.
Yeah.
Bonus points if it's a Selkie and you put it in the coat, because then you get that bit of lore about whoever holds the coat commands the Selkie. But there's also in 2nd edition mage. See, this was like my first mage text that I ever read was the 2nd edition core book prelude story with Amanda, the reincarnated Nefandus. So it's like, is she still evil? Is she not? So what does that do to the character's history? What does that do to their goals and development? Especially if they don't have any like dots in remembrance or memory of their past misdeeds or whatever. So that, I think, would be an interesting character to play.
Mm-hmm.
But fundamentally, I don't think I would play all of these characters. I think this is just a thought exercise for me. Because, I don't know, unless it was a game of just Thallain or Dauntain, I think I'd have a lot of trouble feeling like I was being true to the character. And a game of just Thallain or Dauntain isn't a game I'm interested in.
Would you be okay playing in a game that had Thallain or Dauntain PCs and yours wasn't, but it was all integrated properly? Like, can you think of how that could happen in a way that you're fine with?
Yes, with all of the caveats that we've laid out in this episode.
Yeah.
I think it could work. Yeah. But as it stands, I do think addressing all of those caveats is on the storytellers, because I don't think the game C20 core in particular has made the Dauntain sufficiently distinct enough or the Thallain sufficiently non-toxic enough for me to see interesting stories that can't be told by other groups of Fae. So.
Yeah, but I mean, you could look at the kiths that were only in the 1st edition of Changeling's core book, and I think you can tell all the stories with them too.
Yeah, same.
Yeah.
I 100% agree.
Yeah. Yeah, there's not. We have a bunch of questions and comments, so I think we've addressed most of it. Some of them were like people arguing with each other, I think, but politely.
A lot of them were people talking about their characters, and we think you're all great, but we're not going to read out your characters.
Yeah. One, Luna said, I remember seeing a Reddit post about someone asking how to run a Thallain game, and someone said in said post, can't remember comment or poster, describing over-the-top cartoonish evil as microwaving babies, and it left my mind since. Even if you go with the most dark. I don't feel like the Thallain really are that much into over-the-top cartoonish evil. Like, they're going to evil, but I don't think having characters that do bad things is automatically over-the-top cartoonish evil.
The she can be over-the-top cartoonish evil.
Yeah. Oh, you can do that with anything, but like, I don't think the Thallain are particularly over-the-top cartoonish evil. Some of them are very nasty and dangerous monsters, like by necessity, and some of them are sometimes nasty and dangerous monsters in the way that Kithain are, maybe a little bit more.
Yeah.
It's almost like takes away, it gives reasoning for it in a way that, like, as much as any changeling does anything, like, changelings are not humans. A lot of the motivations are not humans. The fact that knockers want to build things, or the she rule, or Puka lying and playing tricks, like, they might be human activities, but their motivations are a little bit different as changelings. And the Thallain doing evil things, or the Dauntain doing horrible things, there's motivations that make sense in universe, even if they're not human motivations to me.
So Chig says, it's my personal theory that the Thallain and the Kithain were never really supposed to mix. The Shadow Court says, the Shadow Court is an alternative approach to playing Changeling. It is a version of the game for people who tire of sweetness and light, a saga for those who crave the night. I should have said that in a much darker, like, sepulchral voice.
Yeah.
I get that everything was basically almost immediately folded in, but it does say right there in the first book that included the Thallain that it is an alternate, not an addition. 100%.
I disagree. That, well, it depends on what they mean. Like, it's not an alternate game, though. It's like an alternate chronicle.
Well, it's an alternate mode of playing the game. Yeah.
Yeah. And I feel noble court politics is possibly even more alternate.
Perhaps.
Than Thallain. Like, if you make the game about noble court, I don't just mean playing nobles, but like you're playing high-ranking nobles, or you're dealing with all the courtly politics and stuff, like, that's definitely presented as playable, but that's a very different kind of game than a lot of other Changeling Chronicles. So
what I would say, though, is if that was the author's original intention, and I mean, obviously it is a collective setting, it's grown in all kinds of directions, but then it kind of gets back to the point of, as the game presents them in different ways, different permutations of that idea, is it still integrable into the main game?
Yeah. I think also authors' opinions on their books is kind of worthless.
Well, certainly if you give players an inch, they'll take a mile, regardless.
No, I mean, in any book, if an author says something about it, like, it means about as much as anyone else who's familiar with, as familiar with the book. Like, authors say incorrect things about their books all the time, and it doesn't really matter.
I'm willing to say that they're correct when they state their own intentions for the book.
Yeah, the intention was this, but that doesn't mean anything for using the book.
Well, it means that if you are going to use the book in a way that was unintended, the onus is on you to make up any shortfalls that result, I would say.
But I think it's just as likely to make up shortfalls from intended with the, like...
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah.
You could say the book has a purpose, and you try to use it off purpose, sure. Especially, again, you said with collected groups and stuff, it's like, it doesn't really matter. And that was the Shadow Court book. That's not even like C20. So...
I mean, ideally, they will design the things they are putting in the book in such a way that it jives with their intention. However,
I think you should never make that approach with any White Wolf or World of Darkness book.
Well, some authors did it better than others.
Yeah, I'm not trying to knock it. I love it, but trusting that level of precision crafting, I think, is a bad idea. Is there any left? I think we've addressed.
I think Seb had a couple.
Yeah, Theb was sort of arguing with Balor would be the same way. And yeah, a Balor she, especially pre-C20, and a Thallain have a lot of the same concerns.
Yeah.
Absolutely. He's also said, regardless if you use one or branded variety of Dauntain, you're either restricted to just Kithain seems silly to me considering they are in both editions. So what do you think about the policy of Dauntain Thallain in general and his PCs? To me, that aspires the image of darkness scared by light, but what are your general thoughts? I think it works just fine. There's things in Changeling and many other books where it's like, they'll use words like Kithain when talking about whatever, but that's because it's kind of the default. Like, you could do a reading of C20 that suggests enchanted mortals don't take chimerical damage, because it never actually, in the chimerical damage rules, talks about, it's always talking about changelings, but I don't think that, just like that, I don't think it matters. Certainly any changelings could be Dauntain. You said you did, like, in anime before. Or non-changelings. That gets... I mean, you can do it, but...
She's an NPC in Glass Apple, so I don't want to give too much away yet.
Yeah, But I feel like that might be, there's more needles to thread at that point, but like any changeling to me can be Dauntain, not just Kithain.
Yeah, agreed. And then Seb also asks, would you rather have the 1E version of the Dauntain as a PC or the C20 version? How would you combine both types of Dauntain to exist in a game? I don't know if I would combine both types. I would just use the 1E version.
Yeah, I'd use the 1E version. You want to get the Autumn people for the Dauntain, especially. It's less important, I think, for the actual Autumn people. I feel like I'd expand on it more in here, but I think what's in C20 works still. But for Dauntain, yeah, I'd use them. Maybe you could change, like, use the C20 Ruin art. I haven't really gone through in detail if there's new problems in C20 Ruin that aren't in 1E.
Yeah.
But that's about it. I feel like it mechanically, I feel like it's fine to use in C20.
I think some of the other questions in here we've pretty much addressed.
Yeah.
But thanks, listeners. Josh, if people have other questions and comments on this or other future topics we may discuss, what are their options?
You can send us an email, podcast@changelingthepodcast.com. You can go to our website, changelingthepodcast.com. We still on Mastodon. You can send us a toot, changelingpod@dice.camp. You can go to our Discord, discord.me/CTP. And I think that's it.
All of these will be available in the show notes to this episode.
Yeah. Once again, I'm Josh.
I'm the brand of the warlock known as Puka. No, I'm not going to be brand of the warlock. I'm just Puka.
Yeah. 60 seconds to midnight. 60 seconds on nowhere, baby. Have all become victims of the evil midnight bomber that bombs.
Yeah, baby.
Not all Dauntain are broken in ways that are regular or comprehensible to their Kithain cousins. Some have an idiosyncratic kind of damage that no other changeling has suffered from. The Crystal Circle's literature on the matter refers to these unfortunates as off-brand Dauntain, and while their names have been redacted in journal articles by the Ethics Board, their cautionary tales are described in detail by the sorcerers who encountered them. Consider the Boggin, who committed sufficient crimes against fashion to reincarnate as a fae who can only obtain glamour while wearing socks with sandals, forever. Shake your head for the Puka responsible for inspiring an animal-themed song virus that conveys banality to all who hear it and who is now incapable of speech except to sing its numbingly repetitive chorus. And who wouldn't pity the Slua that trafficked with the wrong underworld powers, reborn as a medium who can only, and constantly, see the ghosts of people who died in dramatically ironic accidents? Spare a thought for these poor and broken souls, and if you have a mind to, you can help us fill in some of the gaps in the material we read for this episode, namely, a way that these corruptions of the changeling soul might be healed. And how can you help out with that? Conversations on our Discord at www.discord.me/CTP are always a good way of taking part. Or you can fund our research into the matter through our Patreon at www.patreon.com/changelingthepodcast. Patrons get a shout-out at the end of each episode, so extra special thanks go out to Bad Company, Derek, Dorcadus, Elleris, Hugo the Bogperson, Iabol, Jason Vines, Oreo, Raz Caboose, Sandjigger, Sija, and Simon Strand. We welcome others joining in to support, but equally we welcome reviews on the podcast listening platform of your greatest convenience, and you can always tell your friends, corrupt and twisted or otherwise, about our show. Thanks very much for your ears, and the rest of you as applicable, and do tiptoe carefully around the nightmares as you keep on dreaming.